You know those terrible creators online and in traditional media that just make up the worst things imaginable? Like they write or paint or say something that's absolutely despicable and disgusting, and then they try to defend it by calling everyone too sensitive. Or in one particular case, calling them a furry in a live stream while defending, pretending to make up the term analog horror. But with how often people like this get defended, you end up having to ask, are they right? Are we too sensitive? And if not, what's the line? How far can you go in art before it becomes fetishistic and disgusting? Where are you allowed to go in art, and what ways can you go there? On this episode of Waytat. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Waytat. I am William, and I'll be your host as we toe the line today. But before we get into that, I first want to thank you if you're watching or listening. While things haven't really picked up on the YouTube side of things, my downloads have been increasing on the podcast side of things. So, thank you very much for listening, and please keep doing that. Also, make sure to reach out via email, Twitter, and YouTube comments. And speaking of which, also like, comment, and subscribe for more. Also, check out my friend Win Koshika on their channel. They were taking a break from streaming until pretty recently, just to get some stuff sorted out. But their VOD channel has plenty of stuff to watch and catch up on, so please do that. Also, check out Mystic Luna and Captain Cupcakes. Mystic Luna makes a lot of cool jewelry, and Captain Cupcakes makes a lot of very cool art and stickers. And right now, they're actually doing a portrait commission. But also, yes, Captain Cupcakes is taken. With that, on to the show. Alright, the dreaded line. Which is actually only dreaded if you get close to it, which unfortunately means most adult-oriented stories. The line is what you're allowed to talk about, when you're allowed to talk about it, and why it's there in the first place. But that sounds too black and white. But if that sounds too black and white and like some cancel culture bullshit, first of all, touch grass. Secondly, it's really not. It's a thing that all of us artists have to work with. See, rather than being a sharp, sudden cliff, the line is more like a gradient, and it's not just stuff that makes you uncomfy. The line is the gradient of when a story goes from acceptable to unacceptable. If this still sounds like cancel culture bullshit, look at the previous advice. This is about your reputation as an artist, your audience's enjoyment of your writing, and their retention. A good writer or artist isn't one that pushes on the line too hard and tries to cross it, especially when it would make everyone uncomfortable or deeply offended. But there's not a single place where the line lives. It's not like we have a big old map of where you can and can't go as an artist. Instead, there's a bunch of factors that go into what the limit is, which I am very helpfully going to list off for you now. This is probably going to be the majority of the runtime of this episode. So going from the baseline situational, first is the culture and ethnicity of your target audience. And this is important because different cultures consider different things taboo and to different degrees. And within that culture, different ethnic groups respond very differently to the same information. In fact, some of them may even be dog whistles. For a few examples, if you're an American, you probably know all about the dog whistles of white supremacy, especially in regards to comparisons to animals, the 13%, and a bunch of other numerology bullshit. So if a story starts parroting these things, that'll cross the line for you. assuming that you're an okay person. On the side that isn't about dog whistling and racism and is a lot more cultural, let's say you're from a culture where nudity is an absolute no-go. Well, if there's a bathhouse scene, get ready to be called a pervert on Twitter. I mean, to me, the first one is way worse, but there's absolutely some cultures on Earth that see these as equals. Secondly, is your audience's age. The age of your audience decides where exactly they put their line, largely because of how the mind develops as you age. Creepypastas is an excellent example of this. Younger audiences are attracted to creepypastas because while kind of scary and creepy, things like death, violence, torture, and gore don't affect a general teen audience as hard, because most teens around that age don't have the first or second-hand experience with these things or the capabilities of empathy like adults have. But an older audience, an audience of adults have experienced loss, injury, and seen the effects of violence, and again have a higher level of empathy than teens. Yeah, suddenly stories like Laughing Jack go from creepy to disturbing and concerning. Or they loop, sometimes, depending on how fucked up your sense of humor is, it loops all the way back around to being funny again, but like, in a way that's like, this is terrible writing. But the creepypastas that weren't as popular with teenagers, but are still really good, they tend to focus on abuse, isolation, social embarrassment, betrayal, and losing yourself. All things that are too far for a teen audience, since these things are a lot closer to home and a lot more disturbing to them. But an older audience, while scary and creepy, these things are not over the line at all. Older people care less about these things because they have a much more well-established identity. Also, if you disagree with this example, the specifics can be different for whatever you want to be talking about, generally speaking, but audience age does matter a lot. A third is the audience's gender. This is similar along the lines of both ethnicity and age. Your target audience's gender highly affects the line, probably even more than the other two. And that's because regardless of cultures, there are similar experiences every gender experiences. For example, if your story includes some kind of sexual harassment of women, or ignoring the advice of women, or putting women into a box, and that's portrayed as a good thing, women in your audience and their allies will notice and be very angry. Reasonably so. Meanwhile, men across all cultures are pushed to downplay their emotions and to be providers and protectors. Meaning that if you're writing a story and demonstrating your writing, the men who are providers and protectors are weak, feeble, and stupid, you're going to get a lot of rage from a lot of different cultures. From a surprisingly diverse palette of communities. So with your audience, make sure you know the general swing of the genders that you're going for. Oh, also as a side note, if you're going for the queer audience, make sure you're very aware of the cultural gender identity background. You know, if you write for, like, American non-binary people, for example, try to keep things generally pretty neutral, since non-binary in America rose up in a culture that puts a lot of psychology onto the gender binary, so trying to ascribe a binary one side or the other will definitely toe the line for them. Fourth is your audience's life history. Depending on events in their life, the line will be heavily affected. For example, if you're aiming for an audience that is reading your romance novel because they're divorced and need to pick me up after going through hell, the last thing you want to do is have the entire book be about how divorce is bad and their fault. That will reasonably get shit from everyone, so make sure you're not being a douchebag. And now for the things that are more situational. So, firstly, is one that's fully within your control. Your genre. Because, see, what genre you're writing changes where people will put something acceptable. Someone reading a horror story is expecting gore, violence, and something terrible happening. That is not the case for the exact same person reading a romantic fantasy novel. They're not primed for horror. They're primed for love and probably some sucking and fucking. Basically, this one is know your genre. If you're trying to write for other genres, write for them and stop writing the wrong one. Next is the point of access. This is how people get their hands on your story or your art. This is how people get their hands on your art, which not only changes their lines, but also their demographics. Like if you're selling books on a university campus, you can assume your target audience will be somewhere between 18 and 30, well educated or on the way to it, and have the money to buy your book. This also gets more diverse at community campuses, but I digress. Meaning themes of anti-intellectualism, spitefulness towards the young, and espousing the social benefits of living in the woods off the $3.19 for your entire life savings is not going to go well. That'll be unacceptable to them. While if you post artwork onto sites like Reddit or your stories on specifically r/NoSleep or the much more superior r/Tales from the Creeps, then you're probably writing for an audience that not just enjoys horror, but has access to free horror media and are less likely to be buying a ton of it, which implies a younger audience. And also Redditors. Proceed with caution. Then there's your title and tone. A story with a more in-depth and intellectual sounding title like The Old Gods, an enumeration of ancient long-dead deific manifestations, will draw in an audience that both knows what those words mean and are expecting a piece of writing with a more academic bent to it. While a story called Here's Some Fuck Shit from the Woods will not be that. In a similar bent, if the tone of your story is dirty, grimy, and spiteful, your audience is much more open to the idea of being exposed to some horrific shit with some horrible things said about it. The more forewarning your title and tone are, the further away the line is. But you also need to make sure your title and tone aren't crossing the line themselves. A tone of a story that is less spiteful and more sadistic from moment one can cross boundaries, while a title that is something like, You should kill your grandma with a hammer. It's fun, trust me, would reasonably get people kind of upset. Now, when it gets to something that toes the line itself, you also need to be aware of the wording, because that can be the difference between towing and crossing. Just dropping something on your audience, treating insanely controversial or painful things flippantly, or not treating something with the gravity it deserves will absolutely get you shit. Think about Elias Witherow's stories. Sure, things are treated with gravity, but in many of these stories, he'll just fucking drop something like the brick scene or the majority of Tommy Taffy on you just out of nowhere, which does harden the line for a lot of people. Meanwhile, if you foreshadow adequately, give the moment a lot of gravity and impact throughout the rest of the story, and make it something that's actually discussed and treated with sensitive wording, the line is going to be softened. The next two we're just going to mix together. Those are the artist's reputation and intent. Regardless of the medium, your history as a creator and the intention in which you create will massively impact people's personal line. The more audience goodwill and the better your intentions, the more trust people will have in your writing and the more willing they are to go with you on stuff. But you also got to be careful about your reputation. Because you have your reputation for being a light isekai writer that writes a main character that has a surprisingly healthy relationship with everyone in his isekai mandated harem, but then he just randomly starts treating one character like a disturbingly intense incel, then it not only damages your reputation, but very reasonably makes people question what exactly it is you're trying to say. Or if you normally, make things that are very disturbing and gory horror, and suddenly you start to make smut, people are going to be wary about what you're doing, and if you're going to cross the line into gore smut, which that is a line for the majority of humans, and I'm going to say is the line between healthy and an unhealthy mind. Now, if you go into anything with the intention of crossing lines, then that'll also come through in your art, which, the only people that are going to be into that are, like, edgy 13-year-olds and right-wingers on whatever social media platform you'd be most offended to be well-liked on. The last factor is timing. During times where people are already sensitive about something, you might think it's good to strike while the iron is hot. But unfortunately, not the case. See, writing about how authoritarianism might have some benefits actually is a bad idea right after yet another ICE shooting, because that's less like striking an iron while it's hot and more putting a freshly microwaved egg directly in your mouth. Timing is very important in your artwork, and you need to make sure there's enough space between when the event happened and when you are making art about it for people to not immediately knee jerk against you. But okay, I've told you about the factors going into what can define the line. But these factors don't mean that you can't make art about these topics, or honestly that someone might find your art anyways and consume it without being your target audience. But these things can and will protect you if you do everything right. For example, you're allowed to make a fantasy story that draws strong parallels between fictional racism and real world racism, even using some of those white supremacist talking points in the story. But if you're going to do that, you need to have airtight reputation, a clear intention of making a point that racism is stupid, and making sure that the way you approach the story is as though your entire audience is a member of the race you're alluding to. Will other people see this? Yes, probably. But if you have a good reputation and do this well, you're not even close to crossing any lines. For someone who failed at that, just look at my allusion to the intro. Urban Spook did a terrible job at this, because they, first of all, went in with the intentions of crossing boundaries and making art with unacceptable themes and elements, but then they jump scared people with it, especially the sexual violence aspect, and posted on YouTube, a platform that hosts for free. Now, if you'll recall, horror has thicker boundaries, but it's shock horror, posted for free without much warning, assuming you haven't watched it just because of the reputation, cover topics that are not okay to the majority of people, even in horror, and in a way that didn't give it any real gravity or depth from a new creator without much of a known reputation with the intentions of causing discomfort. Which is all an understandable mistake, but then instead of admitting that they made a mistake, they doubled down, called people pussies, and gave them the double bird brown eye for their troubles. See, you can make art about anything. Urban Spook's actual artwork is very good, disturbing, and creepy, and would be excellent art horror pieces. As a matter of fact, there's no doubt that if Urban Spook just posted those pieces of art, people would love him. Everything around these art pieces, though, is deeply troubling and too far. When people say stuff like art should comfort the unsettled and unsettle the comfortable to justify being an ass or crossing boundaries, or get up in arms about people being upset at an artist for something they put in their art, they're not defending artistic expression. Art shouldn't be done lazily. You need to have good reason to add things to your art and go into your art with intention. Even if that intention is to be raw, that rawness needs to have external things to warn people about how raw it's going to get. But why is that important in the first place? Why should you give a shit about the line in art as an artist? Well, on the more altruistic level, there's the quote-unquote woke and socially conscious approach. See, I like to call it being empathetic and having basic understandings that humans are social creatures and that we live in a society and that empathy is a cornerstone to human existence and is not some woke bullshit. It is an entire part of being human that makes us different from the ant. I'm getting off track. Okay. Here, you're acknowledging that the line is a good thing because making people feel bad feels bad. It should feel bad when you make people feel bad. You fucking monsters. The way the US is right now is making me very angry. Anyways, you don't want to take someone's trauma or life experience lightly, and you really don't want to contribute to a culture of making light of serious topics. Offending, triggering, and underselling are bad. Less altruistically, but still pretty close to the altruistic side of the scale, there's the good writing perspective. See, if you really want to cause your audience misery, jump scaring is about the least effective way to do it. And if that isn't your intention, then jump scaring your audience with something makes even less sense. Jump scares, both in horror movies and with things that are deeply upsetting, only seem effective because they get a knee-jerk rise. But it's poor art. Why? Well, because if you're trying to make art that causes a strong emotion, it's a lot more effective and will get you more of that over time if you do it in the long term, instead of just a sudden spike and then nothing. It flexes that you can harness dread and negative emotion and make something fun out of it and something people want to consume without downplaying any of those aspects. That's a level of mastery that you should flex, that takes time to master. And that is much better than just a sudden, boo, violent crime, and then moving on. For a personal reason, and less on the altruistic side, do you really want to be hounded and hunted down for being insensitive or being an asshole? Is that fun for you? Because if you cross boundaries, it is guaranteed to happen, and you won't even have the shield of normal people to hide behind. Because sure, it's the internet. There's a hater for every shape of content. But if you do something despicable, the normies are not going to be on your side. But you know who will? The most toxic sons of bitches that crawl their way from the sludge. Yeah, that's right, a toxic community. If you aren't looking for a toxic community, they'll probably end up getting investigated by the government, CoffeeZilla, a Predator Hunter account on YouTube.com, or Moist Critical, then best to avoid trying to cross the line intentionally. Especially because it'll limit your art's growth and reach and also massively increase your levels of stress. High cortisol behavior. Which actually leads us to the most selfish one. Clout. See, ruining your reputation and getting chased away from polite society only gives you two options for clout. One, appeal to cringy 13-year-old edgelord incels in the making, or two, right-wing grifting. Both of which are career killers, and the first one is only sustainable for about a year unless you appeal to the next generations of edgelords, which is exceptionally difficult to do. Also, that is not a community that cares about you or will help you on any project whatsoever. They will just point and laugh at you when you fall on your face and fail. And the second might get you a job in government, but that job is probably soon going to get you up a tree, if you know what I mean. So, assuming you don't want those things and you'd rather be good at art, how do you make art that pushes boundaries in a good, well-informed way that doesn't hurt people? Well, it really comes down to a few things being done right. Firstly, make sure you do your research. If you're going to make a story based on or surrounding something that is deeply personal to someone's culture, close to a historic atrocity, or try to talk about trauma or traumatic events, you better know what you're writing about. Like, if you're making an allegory story for British colonization of India, it's a good idea to research how Indians feel about it now and felt about it at the time. Or if you're writing about a character with schizophrenia or who lost a limb, it's a good idea to know what that experience is like. Now, when you do your research, you gotta keep some other things in mind. Make sure you look into the sources you're using and what kind of information they're giving you. Like my Fantasy Army episode? Yeah, weirdly anti-tribal for the primary article I used. That's why I didn't use a lot of their tribal information. Also, make sure you understand the context of what you're researching. Again, if you're looking into a series of events or a historical period, make sure you understand how that period is remembered and what kind of cultural implications it has. This also goes for the design of things. Make sure that your implications are well thought out and considered. And finally, keep in mind, even when you're talking about stuff that is deeply traumatizing, that stuff affects history and history affects it. And that history is full of traumatic events. Use them wisely. Second, keep your tone very intentional. Really interrogate every word, and if it's really needed and necessary. Consider how someone might feel with certain word choices, because some word choices can accidentally be commonly used racist, sexist, homophobic, or ableist terms that you might not catch. Or maybe in some cases could cause the events you're describing to be downplayed, excused, overexposed, or underexposed. Like if you're writing about a brutal melee combat in a standard high fantasy adventure, try using more general words like spray to describe blood instead of spurt, or biting pain instead of the scraping of steel against bone for a stab wound. Because the second one's really describing a much deeper level of detail. On the other side, if you downplay the brutality in your description of a grimdark wargame by the same account, then you play down how truly horrific and brutal the violence is. This is kind of a problem that we've seen with 40K a bit recently. Not necessarily with the novels, but just with the general presentation. They've cleaned up a whole lot, and that kind of downplays how brutal and authoritarian the world building is. Third, have empathy. Put yourself in the shoes of someone this topic will affect the most, and try to write about it in a way for them to feel that you understand not only what you're talking about, but you understand what they've gone through. If you don't know, you at least get it. Empathy is exceptionally important to make characters and your world react genuinely. A big part of it is respecting the impact that it has. Not just on a larger level, but the people directly experiencing what the event is. And if you're having a hard time with this one, you might want to reconsider writing what you're writing. Because if you can't relate or empathize, you just might not be able to do it justice. And that's okay. Whatever thing you decide to write about, you don't have to write about. You can do something else. You can make a different kind of art. You don't have to, try to empathize with someone that you can't. Just make a different kind of art. It's okay. No one has to know. And finally, give your audience just enough exposure. Showing too little or glossing over things can be just as bad as showing too much. Never gloat in the description of horrible things, but also don't shy away. At least to the level your audience's line would allow. Like again, if you're writing in a horrifying grimdark setting, don't revel in people being slaughtered, but at the very least don't shy your audience away from it. On the opposite end, again with our high fantasy example, don't revel in people being slaughtered, but you can shy your audience away from it a bit. So, yeah, that's how you toe the line effectively. But, hey, look, let's just be honest here. Can art go anywhere? Yes. But should it go anywhere? No. Sometimes you can just have fun and make something lighthearted, you dummy. You don't have to make every piece of art meant to make people question their reality. Art is not just about conveying a moral message. Art can be about entertainment. It can be about finding escape. Art can be about telling stories, carrying on tradition or heritage. It can be about all kinds of things that are very important for humanity. You don't have to just constantly be pushing the boundaries. That's not your job as an artist. But anyways, thank you so much for watching or listening. If you have opinions, improvements, corrections, and anything else you want to talk about, comment below or email me at waytatpods@gmail.com. That is WAYTATPODS@gmail.com. And remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. And follow my podcast feed for audio versions, and come back next time when we talk about scale and how silly fiction gets with it. Have a good night. Don't murder, have fun, and remember, you can't be like Urban Spook if you're a furry. Maybe. Anyways, this has been Why Are You Talking About This? I've been your host, William. Good night.